Hello and welcome. It's one of the world's oldest professions, a gun for hire. But being a mercenary in today's world, especially in a place like Iraq, is a lot more complicated. Huge sums of money are involved when it comes to private military companies, and the role they play could have serious implications that go beyond the actual fighting on the ground.
Mercenary, to me, is somebody who goes and fights and gets paid for it, for a cause that is not necessarily for his country or his nation.
They are unemployed soldiers looking for a way to make a living using the only skills they have, which are these military skills.
There's a fundamental difference between an ordinary soldier and a mercenary, if I may use that term. An ordinary soldier who fights under a flag for a particular country has a legitimate use of force, allowing that individual to engage in activities which normally would be considered either criminal or, strictly speaking, murderous, whereas a mercenary lacks that immediate social justification.
That was a clip from the documentary Shadow Company. One US firm providing mercenary forces for Iraq is Blackwater, which has 20,000 soldiers on the ready, the world's largest private military base, and a fleet of 20 aircraft, including helicopter gunships. We'll look at the growth and the use of these private security firms on today's show. Now, don't forget, we take your questions. The numbers are there at the bottom of your screen. Well, joining me to discuss the often secretive world of mercenaries is Jeremy Scahill, an investigative journalist who also reports for the television and radio program Democracy Now! Mr. Scahill recently published Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. He's joining us from New York. And joining us from Los Angeles is the director and producer of Shadow Company, Nick Bicenic. Mr. Bicenic is also the co-founder of the production company Purpose Films. Gentlemen, good to have you both with us.
It's good to be with you, Riz.
Jeremy Scahill, if I could start with you. Thank you. Jeremy, if I could start with you and ask you, why should anyone be worried about the US government using mercenary forces?
Well, I think most people in the United States and indeed in the world think that there are between 130,000 and 145,000 U.S. troops that are occupying Iraq. What's often left out of that equation is the fact that there are 126,000 private contractors, tens of thousands of whom are armed mercenary forces. General David Petraeus, a senior military commander, said that the occupation wouldn't be possible without these private forces. And so what the Bush administration has done is to wage a shadow war by sending mercenary forces into Iraq to effectively double the size of the occupation force. Their deaths don't get counted in the official toll, their injuries don't get counted, and there's no effective laws governing their presence in Iraq. And so we literally don't know the crimes that these forces are committing. We do know that 655,000 Iraqis have been killed. The military forces are subjected to the court-martial system. The mercenaries are subjected to no effective Iraqi law, US law, or international law.
Actually, Jeremy, that's what I was going to ask you, is how accountable are they? I mean, in what way can they be made accountable? Surely there must be some kind of regulation for them coming on board under the US military auspices.
Well, this is a very serious problem, particularly in Iraq. We've had tens of thousands of contractors that have gone in and out of Iraq since March of 2003 when the US invasion began. Only 2 private contractors have been indicted or charged with any crime. So either we have the most saintly mercenaries running around Iraq, or something is very rotten with that system. Now, this is a very hot debate right now in the US Congress, and there's a real question on whether the court-martial system should be applied to them or if US law should be applied to them. But regardless of what the legal system ends up being, the fact is I don't think that there could be any legal system that could effectively govern 130,000 private actors in a war zone.
Well, Nick Bicenic, if I could get you in there from Los Angeles, congratulations on making Shadow Company. In that, you say that the rules of war have changed. In what way?
Well, it's essentially a version of what the answer that Jeremy gave you. The rules of war have changed because if for the US Army alone and for many other Western armies, it's simply not possible to wage a war of the scale that's being waged in Iraq without the usage of private actors. It is worth mentioning that in Iraq alone, a significant percentage of the private security contractors that are operating there are not actually American. It's always tempting to assume that simply because of the fact that they're employees who are connected in some way to the American forces there, that they're absolutely all American citizens. That's not the case. There's a significant number of Iraqis, and in fact, Iraqi-owned private security companies, which doesn't necessarily make the problem smaller, But it does make it different because in many instances, it's the locals that are taking a lot of these jobs and even starting up these companies to get involved there.
Now, why mercenaries have been around for a long time, Nick, and I wonder why is the role of these private military companies so important now?
Well, it's somewhat of an anomaly that we perceive it as a strange thing because it's only really in the last 150 or maybe a tiny bit more years that non-nation state actors have been considered a strange thing. I mean, the phenomenon of the nation state and one of its building blocks being an army that defends its borders is a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of major history. So in medieval times, and in fact way earlier than that, mercenary forces have been a key part of all warfare. Is history turning around? Are we heading in that direction again? Will private companies be a component of a new version of the UN? Who knows? But it's one of the many phenomena that we set out to explore in Shadow Company.
Well, before we get back to Jeremy, Nick, let's have another look at Shadow Company in a clip here, which looks at the monopoly, I guess, of the armies there. This one, I guess, looks at the way perhaps that private armies have been taking over standard army operations. Let's have a look.
The army used to take care of everything. They used to be a self-contained operation. When they went to war, they had all the skills, all the personnel, all the materials. When they began downsizing the military, they simply outsourced things they needed, whether it was technology or security.
It's basically the way we look at the role of the public versus the private, and that's changed over time. People looked at areas of government and said, the market should be doing that. And that was things like education, private prisons, garbage collection, private security. And the final frontier of that was the military. It was the monopoly of the military over the realm of force, and that monopoly has been broken with the private military industry.
Let's get to Jeremy Scahill, who's joining us from New York. And Jeremy, in your book, Blackwater, which is obviously very thoroughly researched, you seem to really be convinced that Blackwater as a company is the product or the lifetime's work of Donald Rumsfeld, the former defense secretary, and Vice President Dick Cheney here in the US. Why are you so sure of that?
Well, I think that we've seen these forces used to double the size of the occupation force, as I said, wage a shadow war. And the fact is that the Bush administration failed to build a coalition of willing nations to invade and occupy Iraq. And so it turned to Blackwater and its other friends from the coalition of billing corporations and staffed the occupation that way. Blackwater portrays itself as an all-American operation, but the fact is that they have deployed mercenaries from Chile in Iraq, some of whom trained and served under the brutal regime of Augusto Pinochet. They've deployed Colombian forces, Polish forces, Bulgarian forces. And the fact is that Blackwater is headed by a man, Eric Prince, who's a significant bankroller of President Bush's political campaigns, the Republican causes, and he has very deep connections to the movements that make up the Christian right in the United States. This is a very frightening development in the history of the use of these mercenary forces. To have a man at the helm of a company who's on the board of Christian Freedom International, an evangelical missionary organization that says that the Bible is the only infallible word of God, to have these kinds of forces deploying in Iraq, a Muslim country, I find very disturbing.
But Jeremy, there is an interesting paradox here, isn't there? If they're mercenaries, they're supposed to be up for sale at I guess, to the highest bidder, or at least if the bill is paid. There would be no ideological aspect to them. There would be just whoever pays the bill, irrespective of who they are, would be able to buy them. Is that correct?
Well, see, what Blackwater has done is it's taken the traditional mercenary motive of money and it's swirled it together with a sort of neo-patriotic justification for serving in this so-called global war on terror. Blackwater relies heavily on the belief among its forces that what they're doing is serving their country. Now, the fact of the matter is that the majority of Americans are now opposed to the war in Iraq. The majority of the world is now opposed to the war in Iraq. And so what Blackwater is doing is providing forces to engage in an offensive occupation, a war of conquest. And I think it's very frightening that when the nation state fails to provide sufficient forces for its army or its military, you can have an administration like the Bush administration turn to the private sector to fuel a war that his own population is against.
Was that, Jeremy, was that the most disturbing thing you came across as you researched Blackwater? Or was there something that really, stuck with you, that this is really quite disturbing?
Well, I think that this nexus of the religious right, the closeness to the Bush administration,